does the future hold for a man loved by some, reviled by others? To answer this question, we're joined by our three guests, all of them in London. Kawa Qureshi, QC, an international law specialist at McNair Chambers. Douglas Murray, Associate Director of the Henry Jackson Society. He's also a best-selling author and award-winning journalist based in London. Anthony Timmins, an activist. He is pro-Assange and pro-Bradley Manning campaigner. Welcome to all of you. Let's start off with you, Mr. Murray. What do you make of his speech? Do you think it leaves him in a stronger position or increasingly vulnerable?
Well, neither. I mean, it's simply evaded all of the important questions. Mr. Assange is wanted by the Swedish authorities to answer claims of a serious sexual case in Sweden. Yet Sweden didn't come up at all in Mr. Assange's strange balcony speech. I think it didn't address any of the important questions in this. And I think one other thing has to be remembered from the outset. Mr. Assange talked about the importance of Barack Obama and America not, as he said, witch-hunting WikiLeaks. This is, again, a great red herring. There is not a witch hunt of WikiLeaks. An organization illegally obtained, or stole as we used to call it, a whole set of government documents and published them with consequences which are still not fully understood and aren't going to roll out for some time to come. Assange didn't mention that. He pretended it was quite something else, as if the American authorities were in a hunt for a phantasmical witch figure. And that isn't the case. There are serious charges against Mr. Assange in Sweden, which he should answer. And the whole issue of his obtaining of documents illegally is another question. But as ever, he has managed to try to blur these and avoid all of the important points.
What do you make of that, Mr. Qureshi?
So far as the speech is concerned, obviously I had the same utterings on part of Mr. Assange. If I look at the situation from a legal perspective, the previous speaker quite rightly pointed out Mr. Assange made absolutely no mention of the subsisting request for extradition made by the Swedish authorities in respect of serious allegations of sexual assault, allegations that were considered by three separate courts in England and Wales, leading to a judgment of nearly 100 pages from our Supreme Court, concluding that the request was a proper request, and in any other circumstances, Mr. Assange would have been returned to Sweden to face criminal process in Sweden.
Why do you
my understanding
think
is that Mr. Assange hasn't
to avoid addressing the issue there? Why did he choose to avoid mentioning Sweden and the sexual allegations? Obviously, this has come after some sort of legal advice.
I assume that because the time limit for appealing the Supreme Court decision expired the day before or the day after that he entered the Ecuadorian embassy, it's not open to him to raise an allegation that the English process was somehow unfair. I don't believe that he's raised an allegation to the effect that the Swedish process is politically motivated or he's unlikely to receive a fair trial. The only legal point he made was whether the prosecutor was entitled to avail himself of the Extradition Act 2003, and the clear answer from our Supreme Court was the prosecutor was. So there are those who may take the view that the recourse to the Ecuadorian embassy in Knightsbridge and placing the United Kingdom authorities in the difficult position where they have to juggle between their responsibilities under the Extradition Act, responsibilities under the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic and Consular Relations of 1961 provides a distraction.
All right, and I see that Mr. Timmins looks rather distracted, and you seem a bit flabbergasted at what you were hearing, Mr. Timmins. What's your response to what our guests have been saying?
Well, I mean, honestly, I have to say, I really have to say, I think it's the only thing that's been evasive is the theme and the tone of this program. We have been conducting, with Wise Up for Bradley Manning, we have been conducting now a 9-week vigil in front of the Ecuadorian embassy. Mr. Assange has the right to seek asylum, and it speaks volumes about our time that people have to actually seek asylum from the United Kingdom. This is a key indicator as to where we are and where we're currently heading. Unfortunately, on Wednesday night, our worst fears were confirmed when 8 police vans pulled up in front of the Ecuadorian embassy, set up a 60-person police station in the same building right across from the Ecuadorian embassy, and threatened to enter it on an obscure 1987 legislation. On an obscure 1987 legislation. Sweden also, the Swedish prosecution, there's been loads of bizarre reaches in all of this, but I think that the most important thing we can all take away from this is that the U.S.'s hand has been involved in this. And the thing I take away from Mr. Assange's speech, as an American, I'm an American, is that he said that, you know, we have to return to our revolutionary origins, or we're going to be going off the cliff. And I think that that's where we're heading. That's certainly where the legal processes are heading.
But Mr. Timmons, doesn't this boil down to, at the end of the day, the subject that he avoided mentioning, the fact that he's wanted in Sweden for questioning about these sexual harassment allegations? If he is innocent, why doesn't he go to Sweden? Because surely he stands more chance of not being extradited to the U.S. from Sweden than staying in the UK.
Can I get a chance to actually, can I get it? Hello? Is it all right if I actually address this?
Please go ahead.
This is incredible. At the end of the day, he's actually decided to stay and fight. Sweden has absolutely no bail, as we understand it. You know, he would be basically thrown into a dock until conditions can be changed. The idea that an extradition warrant could be served when we had 3 dissenting law lords in the Supreme Court who decided against this. Let's remember that he is not actually facing an allegation. He's not. There's been no allegation of rape at all. And also that the 2 women who went there asked for, they went there seeking advice. They also got their story together before they actually went in there. And also they sought the, you know, they went there with their sort of friend who was working at the police station. So a lot of these things are actually quite hooky.
Okay, let's put that to Mr. Qureshi,
extraordinarily concerning to me.
Turn to the legal hat and ask Mr. Qureshi, I mean, are these points valid that Mr. Timmons has raised? I mean, is there really a possibility that Mr. Assange will be extradited to the U.S. if indeed he does go to Sweden?
Forgive me, but your other guest is exercising his right to free speech rather vocally, so I wasn't able to hear you clearly.
What's of great concern to us?
Just wondering, Mr. Timmons, I'm just putting this to Mr. Qureshi, if you don't mind. If you don't mind me taking your points and addressing it to Mr. Qureshi to find out if your fears are indeed valid, the same fears of Mr. Assange, that he will indeed be extradited to the U.S. if he goes to Sweden.
I'm sorry about that. But I just want to make our point is that the Swedish prosecution came to London concerning this particular case. And they refused to meet with his previous lawyers. But they met with the U.S. ambassador, not the U.S. ambassador to Sweden, but the U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom, to the Court of St. James. My strongest concern is, what interest does the U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom have in a Swedish felony?
I sense an agitation in my friend's observations, which were plainly quite emotive and emotional. But speaking from the perspective of a lawyer, perhaps I can explain the following. Whether Mr. Assange likes the result or not, as a result of the legal process that we have, there were 3 law lords who dissented. It was a specially constituted court that produced a judgment of nearly 100 pages, where the majority, and I emphasize the majority, found that the extradition request was valid and that Mr. Assange was required, in accordance with English law and European law, to be returned to Sweden. That's point 1. So far as Mr. Assange's fear in the United Kingdom, I'm not aware of Mr. Assange having raised at any point any suggestion that there's a fear of persecution per se at the hands of the English authorities, or that he fears for his life, safety in England at the hands of the English authorities. What we understand, what I understand, and our friend no doubt will correct me if I'm mistaken, is that Mr. Assange says that in the background, somewhere where there's no evidence, but somewhere in the background, after he's returned to Sweden and he's subjected to the legal process in Sweden, assuming he's prosecuted, convicted, tried, he'll be bounced from Sweden to the United States of America. Now, there are two flaws in that. Firstly, if Mr. Assange is extradited from the United Kingdom to Sweden, and there are many who take the view that this is inevitable, bar some miraculous intervention in Knightsbridge, that Mr. Assange cannot be extradited to the United States of America without the permission of the United Kingdom authorities. That's the first point. And the second point is that Sweden, which many of us have seen as being a bastion of freedom of speech and fundamental liberties, is a place where Mr. Assange can then say, if that eventuality occurs, and I emphasize I've not seen any evidence for this, Mr. Assange will be fully entitled before the Swedish courts, and indeed before the European Court of Human Rights, if it comes to that, to argue that he has a well-founded fear of persecution at the hands of the US authorities, assuming that worst-case scenario, that the US authorities decide to seek his extradition. So
okay, I think you cleared that up. Let's say that you have cleared up that legal issue for us, Mr. Qureshi. Mr. Murray, as Qureshi was saying, there's going to take some sort of divine intervention to get him out of the embassy. I mean, he must be going slightly bonkers staying in that embassy. It's a tiny room. There's no natural daylight. He's got to switch on a little lamp. He's got to walk down the corridor to get water. Do you think that eventually this isolation and possibly paranoia will drive him to leave the embassy?
No, I think Mr. Assange has been bonkers and paranoid for years. It's part of his alleged political makeup, and indeed I would allege that of many of his supporters. This is not about freedom of speech. There's a terrible elision that Mr. Assange and his supporters have been trying to make all along, which is that it should be made, first of all, perfectly legal to steal and publish government documents from the United States or anywhere else. So that's the first thing that they've decided. And the second thing is that they can preemptively decide that the two women in Sweden who've made serious allegations of sexual assault against Mr. Assange are not in any way serious and are somehow put up to it. This is the product of a fevered conspiracy mindset from the beginning. A mindset which is almost messianic in its delusional belief that it can override every single norm of international law, every single norm of criminal law and of national law, and then find itself, and in Mr. Assange's case, in his place of last resort, praising, and I mean it requires a heart of stone not to laugh at this moment, praising the Ecuadorian government for its stand on freedom of speech. I mean, Human Rights Watch found that in 2 weeks of this month alone, the Ecuadorian authorities shut down 6 radio stations and 2 television stations, which they didn't approve of. Ecuador is not a mecca of freedom of speech. It isn't the world capital of decency. It's the last seedy bolt hole to which Mr. Assange thinks he can run, instead of facing, as I say, the very serious allegations which he should face, whether he is whether he thinks himself innocent or not, in Sweden. And it is an absolute disgrace that this discussion about Mr. Assange and his status can continually be pretended to be not about sexual assault claims or the stealing of secret documents and the publishing of them with untold consequences, but something to do with freedom of speech. I mean, even if the Ecuadorian government weren't alongside Mr. Assange on this, it really is enough to make a cat laugh.
There seems to be yet another mixed message which I'd like to put to Mr. Timmins. Assange is also calling for the release of the Russian punk band Pussy Riot. I mean, this comes from a man who worked for Russia Today. Russia Today's boss is Putin. His government is behind putting those girls behind bars. What do you think he was driving at there?
Exactly.
Well, I think that the most shocking thing has been the UK's threat to storm the Ecuadorian embassy.
No, I'm asking you about what Assange was trying to get across.
Territory.
I was asking you what he's trying to get across.
I know that,
you put your point across about storming the embassy. So let's move on to other points, if you don't mind.
Well, not really, because we have to address what was actually just said. But the broadest, most shocking abuse of law has been the threat of the storming of the Ecuadorian embassy. I have spoken to hundreds of Ecuadorians.